somewhere along the sunlit curve of the Bay of Naples, almost 2,000 years ago, there was a town that woke slowly each morning, the way most towns do, with the smell of bread rising from clay ovens and the soft clatter of wooden shutters being pushed open to let in the light. This was Pompeii, a settlement of perhaps 11,000 people, tucked onto a plateau of hardened lava from eruptions so ancient that no one living there had any memory of them at all. To the people who lived here, the mountain that rose gently to the north, the one we now call Vesuvius, was simply part of the scenery. It was green with vineyards from its base, almost to its summit. It gave shade in the evenings. It was, as far as anyone could tell, simply a mountain. And mountains did not do anything except stand still and be beautiful. We are going to spend the next several hours moving slowly through this town, not through the moment it is best remembered for, but through the ordinary, unremarkable, deeply human rhythm of daily life that filled the 18 centuries before that. We will walk its streets in the cool of early morning, sit in its kitchens while bread bakes, listen to merchants haggle in its markets, and rest in the shade of its courtyards. There is no need to hurry through any of it. Pompeii was, more than anything else, a place where people simply lived. The town itself sat close to the sea, though the coastline in ancient times ran nearer to the city walls than it does today. Centuries of volcanic sediment having pushed the shore further out since then. Ships could dock nearby, bringing in goods from across the Mediterranean, and this closeness to trade routes shaped almost everything about how Pompeii grew. It was not a grand imperial capital. It was something gentler and, in a way, more relatable. A comfortable regional town, prosperous but not extravagant, where wealthy villa owners and modest shopkeepers lived only streets apart from one another. The land here was extraordinarily fertile. Volcanic soil, for all the danger eventually associated with it, is remarkably good at growing things, rich in minerals that plants use eagerly. The slopes of Vesuvius were covered in vineyards producing wine that traveled well beyond the region, and the plains below were planted with wheat, olives, and vegetables that fed the town's households throughout the year. Farmers rose before dawn, much as farmers still do, moving out along dirt paths toward fields that shimmered faintly with morning mist rolling down off the mountain. Inside the town walls, the streets were paved with large, uneven stones, worn smooth in places by decades of cartwheels and sandaled feet. If you walked along one of these roads today, you would still see the ruts carved into the stone, a quiet record of thousands of ordinary journeys that were never meant to be remembered, simply lived. Raised stepping stones crossed at intervals, so that people could cross from one side of a street to the other, without stepping into the water and waste that ran along the gutters. A small but thoughtful piece of urban design that tells us something about how carefully these streets were used every single day. The buildings themselves varied enormously in size and grandeur. And this is one of the more comforting things about Pompeii once you begin to understand it closely. It was not a city sorted neatly into rich neighborhoods and poor ones. Instead, a wealthy family's spacious home, with its painted walls and private garden, might sit directly beside a cramped one-room apartment above a shop, the two households sharing the same street, the same well, sometimes even the same wall. Life here was layered rather than separated, and that layering meant that the sounds of the town blended together throughout the day. A blacksmith's hammer somewhere nearby, a child laughing in a doorway, the low murmur of two neighbors discussing the price of olive oil. Pompeii had been shaped by many different peoples before the Romans made it fully their own. The Oscans had lived here first, and later the Samnites. Then briefly, it fell under Greek cultural influence, and eventually the Romans absorbed it into their growing world after a series of wars in the region. By the time we are picturing in this story, sometime around the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, Pompeii had become a proudly Roman town, though it still carried traces of these earlier layers in its language, its temples, and even in the shapes of some of its older buildings. It is worth pausing here simply to imagine the pace of a normal day, because that pace is really what this story is about. Romans in towns like Pompeii rose with the sun, since lamplight was expensive and daylight was free. The very early morning hours were often the busiest, filled with visits to patrons, opening of shop shutters, and the movement of goods into the forum for the day's business. By midday, much of the town would slow considerably, particularly during the warmer months, when people retreated indoors or into shaded courtyards to eat, rest, and wait out the heat before returning to their afternoon tasks. The town had been growing and changing for centuries by the time of our story, and it bore the marks of that growth openly. An earthquake, a serious one, had struck the region 17 years before the events this documentary eventually leads toward, and much of Pompeii had spent the years afterwards slowly rebuilding. Scaffolding stood in several parts of town. Half-finished renovations sat quietly beside completed ones. In some ways, Pompeii in its final years was a town in the middle of repairing itself, patient and unhurried, the way towns often are, never quite finished, never entirely still. As we move through this story together, segment by segment, we will walk through the forum where public life unfolded, step into the private homes where families ate and slept and argued gently over small things, wander through workshops and bakeries and taverns, visit the baths where the whole town gathered to relax, and sit for a while in gardens tended with quiet care. Only much later in our journey will we turn toward the mountain itself, and even then we will do so slowly and gently, focusing simply on what is known and understood, without any need to dramatize what was, after all, simply one more chapter in the long life of an ordinary and rather lovely town. For now, it is enough to picture the town as it was on any ordinary morning. Sunlight beginning to warm the stone streets, doves settling on rooftops, the scent of baking bread drifting from a corner oven. Somewhere, a dog stretching in a doorway. Somewhere else, a merchant unrolling an awning over his shop front. Nothing remarkable happening at all, and everything, in its own quiet way, worth remembering. We will return here, to this same street, many times throughout our journey tonight, each time a little later in the day, each time learning a little more about the people who called this place home. For now, let yourself simply rest in the stillness of this early morning, in a town that, for a great many ordinary years, was simply and peacefully alive. If you had woken early in Pompeii and made your way toward the center of town, you would eventually have found yourself standing in the Forum, the open rectangular plaza that served as the heart of nearly everything the town did together as a community. The Forum was framed on almost every side by columns, long covered walkways called porticos that offered shade from the sun and shelter from the occasional rain. Beneath these covered walkways and around the edges of the open plaza itself stood many of the buildings that mattered most to daily Roman civic life, temples devoted to different gods, administrative buildings where local officials conducted business, and a large covered market hall where food and goods were bought and sold. At the northern end of the Forum stood the Temple of Jupiter, one of the most important religious structures in the town, dedicated to the chief god of the Roman pantheon, and later shared in worship with Juno and Minerva as well. The three gods often honored together in what is called the Capitoline Triad. The temple sat upon a raised platform, reached by a set of stone steps, so that it rose above the rest of the Forum, both physically and symbolically. A quiet reminder of where religious authority sat within the town's sense of itself. Nearby stood other temples as well, including one dedicated to Apollo, believed to be among the oldest religious sites in Pompeii, its origins reaching back long before the Romans themselves arrived in this part of Italy. And along another edge of the Forum stood the Macelum, the covered food market, where stalls sold fish brought in fresh from the bay that same morning, along with meat, fruit, and vegetables gathered from the surrounding countryside. It is worth taking a moment simply to imagine the sound of the Forum in the early hours after sunrise. Vendors calling out gently to passers-by, not with urgency, but with the practiced, easy rhythm of people who did this every single day of their working lives. The soft scrape of baskets being set down on stone counters, coins changing hands with a small metallic clink. Somewhere, a public official reading, a notice aloud from a wax tablet posted on a wall informing citizens of an upcoming election, or a public announcement from the town council. Pompeii, like most Roman towns of its size, governed itself through a system of locally elected officials. Two men called duumviri oversaw the town's legal and administrative affairs each year, while two others called aediles managed public buildings, markets, and civic maintenance. These positions were filled through elections that citizens took seriously. And if you walked along almost any street in Pompeii, you would see painted electoral notices on the walls of houses and shops. Endorsements written in red or black paint by ordinary residents in support of particular candidates. Some of these painted messages survive to this day, faded but legible, offering a strangely intimate glimpse into how personally involved everyday townspeople felt in the outcome of local elections, campaigning for their preferred candidates the same way a neighbor today might put a sign in their front yard. The Forum was also where justice was administered. The Basilica, a large rectangular building along one side of the plaza, served as the town's law court and central meeting hall for business transactions. Its interior was lined with tall columns supporting a raised roof, allowing light to filter down into the hall below. And it was here that disputes were argued, contracts finalized, and civic matters discussed among citizens gathered beneath its shaded colonnades. Public life in a Roman town like Pompeii was, in many ways, lived outdoors, and the Forum was the clearest expression of that. Homes, particularly wealthier ones, often turned inward toward private courtyards rather than outward toward the street, which meant that much of the socializing, business, and political conversation that we might now associate with private offices or living rooms instead took place here, in the open plaza, beneath the shade of public colonnades, surrounded by temples and market stalls, and the low murmur of hundreds of ordinary conversations happening at once. As the morning went on, the Forum would have grown steadily busier. Farmers arriving from the countryside with carts of produce, bakers sending assistants to purchase grain, wealthy citizens moving through the crowd trailed by clients. A distinctly Roman social relationship in which less powerful citizens would attach themselves to a wealthier patron, offering political support and public loyalty in exchange for financial assistance or legal protection. This patron-client relationship shaped much of Roman social life, and its rhythms were visible every morning in the Forum, as clients gathered outside their patrons' homes at dawn to offer greetings and accompany them into town for the day's business. By mid-morning, the Forum would have been filled with a gentle, steady hum of activity, a town going about the unremarkable, comforting business of being itself. Vendors selling small breakfast foods to passers-by who hadn't eaten before leaving home. Officials moving between buildings with scrolls tucked under their arms. Somewhere in a corner near the market hall, an elderly man might be seated on a stone bench, simply watching the crowd pass, the way people have always liked to sit and watch a busy square go about its day. The Forum, like much of Pompeii, was also, at the time of our story, partly under repair. Some of its temples and public buildings still bore visible signs of the earthquake damage from years earlier, with scaffolding standing quietly against certain walls and stonework in various stages of restoration. And yet daily life continued fully around these unfinished corners, because that is simply what daily life does. People do not pause their mornings to wait for construction to finish. They simply move around it, adapt to it, and carry on. As we leave the forum for now and begin making our way toward the quieter residential streets nearby, it is worth carrying with you this image. A wide, sunlit plaza, lined with temples and shaded colonnades, filled each morning with the unhurried business of an ordinary town, its citizens moving between market stalls and law courts and painted campaign notices, entirely unaware that any of this deserved to be remembered as anything other than another Tuesday. Let us leave the noise of the forum behind for a while and step, instead, through the narrow doorway of an ordinary Pompeian home, into the quieter, more private world where families spent the greater part of their daily lives. A typical Roman house of this kind, called a domus, was built with a particular kind of privacy in mind, one very different from the way many of us live today. From the street, the house often presented very little to see. A plain wall, a modest doorway, perhaps a small shop built into the front of the building, and rented out to a merchant, since even wealthy homeowners often used the street-facing rooms of their property for commercial purposes. But once you stepped through that doorway, the house opened up entirely inward, arranged around a series of courtyards that let in light and air while keeping the bustle of the street safely outside. The first of these courtyards was usually the atrium, a rectangular hall open to the sky through a rectangular opening in the roof called the compluvium. Rain falling through this opening would collect in a shallow basin below, called the impluvium, which was both practical, helping to gather water for household use, and beautifully simple in its design. The sound of rain gently falling into that basin becoming one of the quiet, familiar sounds of home for anyone who lived beneath such a roof. The atrium served as a kind of formal reception space, the room where the head of the household would greet clients and guests each morning, and it was often decorated with some of the finest artwork in the home. Walls throughout Pompeian houses were commonly painted in rich, warm colors, deep reds and soft yellows, and earthy ochres, decorated with scenes drawn from mythology, garden landscapes, or elegant architectural illusions that made rooms feel larger and more open than their actual walls allowed. Floors were often paved with mosaic, small tiles called tesserae arranged into geometric patterns, or, in wealthier homes, detailed pictorial scenes, laid by hand with a patience that is difficult to fully imagine today. Moving further into the house, beyond the atrium, one would typically reach the tablinum, a kind of study or office where the homeowner kept household records and conducted more private business. And beyond that, often, a second and even more private courtyard called the peristyle, a garden surrounded on all sides by a covered colonnade. This is where much of the family's actual daily life took place, away from the more formal public atrium. Peristyle gardens were planted with flowers, herbs, small fruit trees, and sometimes fountains or small pools. And archaeologists have been able to determine, through careful excavation of root cavities preserved in the volcanic material, a great deal about exactly what kinds of plants grew in these gardens. Roses, violets, box hedges, trimmed into careful shapes, fig trees offering shade in one corner. It is worth sitting with this image for a moment. A family gathered in the soft, dappled light of a peristyle garden in the late afternoon. The sound of a small fountain somewhere nearby, the smell of herbs growing along the garden's edges, children perhaps playing quietly near a shaded colonnade, while adults rested after the heat of midday had passed. This was, for many Pompeian families, simply what an ordinary evening looked like. Roman households were organized around a clear structure of family, and in many homes, enslaved individuals as well, whose labor sustained much of the daily functioning of the house, from cooking and cleaning to childcare and skilled trades. This was an integral and difficult part of Roman society, and it is worth acknowledging honestly and without embellishment, since enslaved people made up a significant portion of the population in towns like Pompeii, and their lives, though often left out of the grander artistic and architectural records, were very much part of what kept these households running each day. Bedrooms in a Roman domus, called cubicula, were typically small, simple rooms, often without windows, since much of daily life took place in the open courtyards rather than enclosed private rooms. Furniture throughout the house tended to be relatively sparse by modern standards. Wooden beds with woven rope supports and stuffed mattresses, storage chests, small tables, and folding stools, along with oil lamps that provided a soft, flickering light once the sun had set. Kitchens in Pompeian homes were often small and functional, tucked toward the back of the house, equipped with a raised masonry hearth where charcoal fires were used for cooking. Bronze and ceramic pots, many of which have been recovered remarkably intact from the ash, sat within reach of the cook, alongside grinding stones for preparing grain and herbs. Meals were often simple and prepared fresh, since refrigeration, as we understand, it did not exist, and households relied on daily trips to the market for fresh ingredients rather than extensive storage. Not every home in Pompeii, of course, resembled this spacious, garden-filled domus. Many residents, particularly those of more modest means, lived in smaller apartments, often located above shops along the town's busier streets, accessed by simple wooden staircases, and consisting of only 1 or 2 rooms. These upper-floor apartments, called sonacula, were more cramped and simpler in decoration, though excavations have shown that even modest households often took some care in decorating their walls, however humbly, with painted plaster in cheerful colors. What is perhaps most striking, when you begin to look closely at Pompeian homes as a whole, is simply how much variation existed side by side within the same town, sometimes within the very same block. A merchant's family living above their shop might share a common wall with a spacious garden villa belonging to a wealthy trading family. The two households experiencing daily life in very different ways, yet bound together by the same streets, the same neighborhood wells, the same rhythms of morning and evening. As dusk settled over the town, oil lamps would begin to be lit throughout these homes, small flickers of warm light appearing in windows and doorways along the street, and families would gather for their evening meal, the day's business and errands finished, the noise of the forum and the workshops fading into a quieter, more restful hum. It is in this soft, settling quiet, this ordinary transition from a busy day into a peaceful evening, that we will leave the Pompeian home for now, carrying with us the picture of a garden courtyard at dusk, a fountain trickling softly nearby, and a family resting together at the end of an unremarkable, comfortable day. By mid-morning, the streets of Pompeii would have settled into the steady, familiar rhythm of a working town. And if we follow one of the main thoroughfares away from the forum, we begin to pass, one after another, the small shops and workshops that lined nearly every street in the city. Pompeii was, in many ways, a town built around small business. Archaeologists have identified well over 100 shops and workshops within the excavated portion of the city, ranging from bakeries and bars to textile workshops, metalworking shops, and stores selling everything from pottery to perfume. Many of these businesses followed a similar architectural pattern. A wide street-facing opening, closed at night with wooden shutters that slid into grooves still visible in the stone thresholds today, and a counter near the front where goods could be displayed and sold directly to passers-by. Bakeries were among the most common and easily recognizable of these shops, identifiable even now by their large, dome-shaped ovens made of stone and brick, and by the heavy, rotating mills used to grind grain into flour. These mills, shaped like large stone hourglasses, were turned either by donkeys or, in some cases, by enslaved laborers, walking in slow, continuous circles to grind the wheat that would become the town's daily bread. One of the bakeries in Pompeii still contained, at the time of excavation, loaves of bread that had been left in the oven, their shape, and even the scoring marks on their crusts remarkably preserved, offering an oddly intimate glimpse into a single ordinary moment on what would become the town's final day. Nearby, one might find a thermopolium, a kind of small food and drink counter that served warm meals to people who did not have kitchens of their own, or who simply wanted a quick meal while running errands through town. These counters were built with large ceramic jars called dolia set into the countertop itself, used to hold and serve food such as stews, beans, and warm wine mixed with spices. Thermopolia were extremely common throughout Pompeii, found on many street corners, functioning much like small, informal cafes where neighbors might pause for a few minutes, exchange a bit of local news, and continue on with their day. Textile production was another significant part of Pompeii's economy, and the town contained a number of phalanaki, workshops where wool cloth was cleaned, treated, and prepared for sale. This work involved treading cloth in large stone basins filled with water, and notably urine, which was collected specifically for its ammonia content and used as a cleaning agent, a detail that often surprises modern audiences, but was simply an accepted and practical part of ancient textile processing. Workers would stand in these basins for extended periods, working the cloth with their feet in a slow, rhythmic motion before rinsing and stretching it to dry. Metalworkers, carpenters, and potters also kept workshops throughout the town, each trade filling the surrounding streets with its own particular sounds and smells. The steady ring of a blacksmith's hammer against metal, the earthy scent of wet clay being shaped on a potter's wheel, the soft rasp of a carpenter's tool smoothing a wooden beam. None of these sounds would have seemed remarkable to anyone living in Pompeii at the time. They were simply the ordinary background music of a town going about its working day, much the way traffic or distant construction might form the background of a modern city street. Trade connected Pompeii to a much wider world than its town walls might suggest. Its position near the coast, along with its access to the Sarno River, allowed goods to move relatively easily between Pompeii and other parts of the Roman world. Wine and a fermented fish sauce called garum, produced in significant quantities in the region and considered something of a local specialty, were exported to other parts of Italy and beyond, while pottery, glassware, and other goods arrived from distant provinces, carried by ship into the nearby harbor, and then by cart into the town itself. Money changed hands constantly throughout the working day, and Pompeii, like the rest of the Roman world, operated on a currency system of bronze, silver, and occasionally gold coins, carefully weighed and valued according to standards set by the imperial mint. Merchants kept simple records of transactions, some of which, written on wax tablets, have survived remarkably well, offering historians small, specific details about prices, debts, and the ordinary financial concerns of everyday Pompeian life. The cost of a jug of wine, the price of a length of cloth, a small loan between neighbors. As the day moved toward its warmest hours, activity in the shops would typically slow, following the same rhythm as the rest of the town. Shutters might be partially closed, shop owners retreating to the shaded interior to rest during the hottest part of the afternoon, before reopening again as the temperature eased in the later hours of the day. This pattern of work, rest, and renewed work shaped nearly every trade in the town, a steady, unhurried rhythm that had likely repeated itself, largely unchanged, for generations of shopkeepers before them. It is easy, looking back from such a great distance in time, to think of the people who ran these shops only in the abstract, as distant figures from a history book, but the details that survive: a loaf of bread left mid-bake, a wax tablet recording a small unpaid debt, a stone counter worn smooth by years of resting elbows, remind us that these were simply people going about their working lives, concerned with the same small, practical matters that occupy working people in any era: making enough to get by, keeping good relationships with neighbors and customers, and at the end of a long day, looking forward to a warm meal and a bit of rest. As the shops along the street begin, in our imagination, to quiet down for the afternoon lull, we will leave this working world behind for now and turn, instead, toward one of the most beloved parts of daily Roman life: the public baths, where the entire town, regardless of wealth or trade, gathered together to relax. There were few institutions in Roman daily life quite as central or quite as beloved as the public baths, and Pompeii, despite its modest size, was home to several of them, each offering the town's residents a place to wash, rest, and socialize away from the demands of work and household duties. The largest and most well-preserved of these is known today as the Stabian Baths, a complex that had stood in various forms for several centuries by the time of our story, having been expanded and renovated many times to meet the needs of a growing town. Like most Roman bathing complexes, it was organized around a sequence of rooms kept at different temperatures, allowing bathers to move gradually from cooler spaces into warmer ones, and eventually back again, in a slow, deliberate process that was as much about relaxation and ritual as it was about basic hygiene. A visit to the baths typically began in the apoditerium, a changing room where bathers would remove their clothing and leave their belongings, often watched over by an attendant or a trusted enslaved servant to prevent theft, a practical concern in any communal space. From there, bathers might begin in the frigidarium, a room built around a cold plunge pool, its walls sometimes decorated with cool blues and greens to visually reinforce the sense of refreshing chill. The purpose of the cold room was both practical, closing the pores of the skin, and simply pleasant, especially after the heat of a Mediterranean afternoon. From the frigidarium, bathers would typically move into the tepidarium, a warm, gently heated room meant to ease the body slowly toward greater heat, and finally into the caldarium, the hottest room in the complex, heated by an ingenious system called a hypocaust, in which hot air from a furnace was circulated beneath a raised floor and through hollow spaces built into the walls, warming the entire room evenly and allowing bathers to sweat gently in comfortable, steady heat. Some caldaria also contained a heated pool, along with a large marble or stone basin called a labrum, filled with cool water that bathers could use to splash their faces and necks for relief. The engineering required to heat these rooms consistently, day after day, was considerable, and it relied on enslaved workers and free laborers alike, tending furnaces constantly, feeding them with wood, and monitoring the flow of heated air beneath the floors. It is worth pausing on this detail for a moment, since the comfort experienced by bathers relaxing in warm, steam-filled rooms depended entirely on the steady, largely unseen labor happening just out of sight, in furnace rooms kept burning throughout the day. Bathing in Roman culture was rarely a quick, purely functional activity. Instead, it was deeply social, a place where people from different walks of life crossed paths regularly, exchanged news, discussed business, and simply enjoyed a few unhurried hours away from their usual routines. Some baths in Pompeii included exercise areas as well, open courtyards called palistri, where visitors might engage in modest physical activity, such as a gentle ball game or simple stretching exercises, before proceeding into the bathing rooms themselves, following a rhythm of activity and rest that many Romans considered essential to a balanced, healthy life. Bathing complexes were typically divided into separate sections for men and women, either through entirely separate wings of the building or through scheduled hours reserved for each. And admission was usually quite inexpensive, making the baths accessible to a wide range of Pompeian society, from wealthy merchants to modest laborers, all sharing, in their own scheduled hours, the same warm rooms and the same slow, steady rhythm of rest. The walls of Pompeii's baths, much like its homes, were often decorated, sometimes with simple geometric patterns, sometimes with more elaborate painted scenes, and the floors were frequently laid with mosaic, some depicting marine creatures or gentle abstract designs suited to a space built around water and warmth. Small details, a bench worn smooth by generations of bathers, a drainage channel cut carefully into the floor, a faint trace of painted plaster still clinging to a wall, remind us that these were spaces built with real care and, in their own quiet way, genuine artistry, meant to make an ordinary daily activity feel a little more pleasant, a little more restorative. After bathing, visitors would typically be given a light oil massage, using scented olive oil applied, and then scraped away with a curved metal tool called a strigil, a practice that served both to clean the skin thoroughly and to leave bathers feeling refreshed and loose after their time in the heated rooms. Some visitors might linger afterward in a courtyard or covered walkway, chatting quietly with friends, perhaps discussing the news from the forum earlier that day, before finally dressing and making their way back out into the streets as the afternoon began to soften toward evening. For many residents of Pompeii, a visit to the baths marked one of the most restful, unhurried parts of an otherwise busy day. A space set deliberately apart from work and obligation, where the simple, universal pleasures of warmth, water, and quiet conversation were available to nearly everyone in town. It is a comforting thing to imagine. Even now, this steady daily ritual of moving slowly from cool rooms to warm ones, of resting in gentle heat, of feeling, if only for an hour or two, entirely unburdened by the small pressures of ordinary life. As the afternoon light begins to lengthen and soften outside the baths, we will follow the town's residents back out into the streets once more, this time toward the evening meal and toward the quiet, familiar comforts of food and family that closed out most ordinary days in Pompeii. As the light over Pompeii began to soften into late afternoon, and the heat of the day eased into something gentler, households throughout the town would have started turning their attention toward the evening meal, a moment that then as now tended to slow the pace of the day and draw families together. The main meal of the day for most Romans was called the cena, typically eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, once the day's business and errands had largely been completed. For wealthier households, the cena might be a relatively elaborate affair, taken in a dining room called a triclinium, named for the 3 couches arranged around a central table on which diners would recline while eating, a posture that might seem unusual to us today, but was simply the accepted, comfortable way of enjoying a meal in Roman culture. Guests would lean on one elbow, propped against cushions, reaching forward to select food from shared dishes, while servants moved quietly between the couches, refilling cups and clearing empty platters. For more modest households, the evening meal was typically simpler and less formal, eaten at a plain table rather than reclining on couches, but no less central to the rhythm of the day. Regardless of a household's wealth, the evening meal tended to follow a similar general structure. A lighter starting course, often including eggs, olives, or small vegetable dishes, followed by a main course of meat, fish, or a hearty grain-based dish, and finishing with fruit or a simple sweet, such as honeyed pastries. The food itself, much of it grown or raised nearby, reflected the rich agricultural landscape surrounding Pompeii. Bread formed the foundation of most meals, made from wheat ground locally and baked fresh, often that same day. Olive oil was used generously, both in cooking and as a simple accompaniment to bread. Vegetables such as cabbage, lentils, and onions were common, along with fruit like figs, grapes, and apples, many grown in nearby orchards, or even within the small kitchen gardens attached to individual homes. Fish and seafood featured prominently as well, unsurprising given the town's closeness to the bay. And one particular condiment, garum, the fermented fish sauce mentioned earlier in our journey through Pompeii's workshops, appeared in a remarkable number of Roman recipes, used much the way we might use salt or soy sauce today, to add a deep, savory richness to a wide variety of dishes. Meat, particularly pork, was eaten as well, though likely less frequently in more modest households, where it may have been reserved for special occasions or religious festivals rather than eaten as a matter of daily course. Wine accompanied nearly every meal, and it held a significant place in Roman culture more broadly, not simply as a beverage, but as an important part of hospitality and social ritual. Roman wine was typically diluted with water before drinking, sometimes flavored with honey or spices, and the proportion of water to wine could vary depending on the occasion and the preferences of those gathered. Sharing a cup of wine with guests or family at the end of the day was considered an important social gesture, a small ritual of hospitality that closed out the day's obligations and welcomed a more relaxed, unhurried evening. As dinner wound down in households throughout Pompeii, conversation would likely have turned toward the ordinary matters that fill most family evenings in any era. News from the forum, updates on a neighbor's health, the progress of a shop's business that week, or perhaps simply quiet, unremarkable chatter between family members, glad simply to be resting together after a long day. Outside, as dusk deepened into evening, the streets of Pompeii would have grown gradually quieter. Oil lamps, small ceramic vessels filled with olive oil and fitted with a simple wick, would be lit throughout homes and shops, casting warm, flickering light through doorways and windows, though the streets themselves would have remained largely dark, lit only faintly by whatever light spilled outward from nearby buildings. Because of this darkness and the practical difficulty of moving safely through unlit streets, much of Pompeian social life naturally wound down as evening deepened, most residents choosing to remain at home once night fully settled over the town. Not every evening was quiet, of course. Pompeii had a number of taverns and small bars scattered throughout its streets, and in the evenings, these would fill with a modest, easy hum of conversation, patrons gathering over cups of wine to talk, play simple games, or simply enjoy company outside their own households for a while. Archaeologists have found gaming pieces and dice in several of these establishments, small, ordinary objects that speak quietly to the simple pleasure of an evening spent unwinding with friends. For most households, though, the end of the day meant simply retreating into the quiet comfort of home. The day's obligations set gently aside until morning. Lamps would eventually be extinguished one by one throughout the house, the soft murmur of family conversation fading into stillness, and the household would settle into sleep, following the same unhurried, universal rhythm that has closed out ordinary days in ordinary homes for as long as people have gathered together at day's end to eat, to rest, and to simply be present with one another for a little while before sleep. It is in this quiet, settling stillness, lamps dimming one by one across the town, that we will pause our journey through Pompeii's daily life for now, before turning, in our next segment, toward the gardens, courtyards, and green spaces that gave the town so much of its gentle character. Pompeii, for all its bustling streets and busy commerce, was also, in a great many quiet corners, a remarkably green town. And it is worth spending some time now simply resting among its gardens before we continue further into the rhythms of daily life. We touched briefly, earlier in our journey, on the peristyle gardens found within many Pompeian homes, those shaded courtyards surrounded by covered colonnades where families gathered in the cooler hours of the day. But gardens in Pompeii extended well beyond these private household courtyards. The town contained larger cultivated spaces as well, including vineyards within the city walls themselves, and even a large outdoor arena-adjacent garden used, according to archaeological evidence, for growing produce sold commercially, rather than simply for private enjoyment. Archaeologists have been able to reconstruct these ancient gardens with surprising precision, largely due to a technique developed by the researcher Wilhelmina Jastrzębski, who realized that hollow cavities left in the hardened volcanic material, where plant roots had once been before decomposing entirely away, could be carefully filled with plaster to create detailed casts, revealing the exact size, shape, and placement of the plants that had grown in these spaces nearly 2,000 years earlier. Through this remarkable method, we know a great deal about what actually grew in Pompeian gardens. Fruit trees such as figs, lemons, and olives, alongside flowering plants like roses and violets, along with practical herb gardens growing rosemary, mint, and other plants used both in cooking and in traditional medicine. Gardens served many purposes in Roman life beyond simple decoration. They provided fresh produce for household kitchens, fragrant herbs for cooking and healing, and shaded, peaceful spaces for rest and quiet conversation. Wealthier homes sometimes included small fountains or shallow, reflecting pools within their gardens, along with statues depicting gods, mythological figures, or simply pleasant decorative scenes, chosen to bring a sense of calm beauty into the household's private outdoor space. Gardens were also, quite often, spaces of religious significance, since Roman households maintained a close, ongoing relationship with a particular set of household gods known as the Lares and Penates. Nearly every Pompeian home, regardless of size or wealth, contained a small shrine called a lararium, dedicated to these household spirits believed to protect the family, the home, and in many cases, the household's food stores and daily prosperity. These shrines took different forms depending on the household's means. In wealthier homes, they might be an elaborately painted niche built into a wall, sometimes located within the garden itself, while in more modest homes, a small shelf or simple painted image might serve the same purpose. Family religious practice in Pompeii was, in this way, deeply woven into the fabric of ordinary daily life, rather than separated into occasional formal ceremonies alone. Each morning, it was common for the head of the household to offer a small prayer or a simple offering, perhaps a bit of food, wine, or incense at the household's lararium. A quiet, routine gesture meant to maintain the goodwill of the spirits believed to watch over the home. These small, repeated acts of devotion, performed daily by countless households throughout the town, formed a gentle undercurrent of religious practice that ran alongside the more public, formal worship conducted at the grand temples in the Forum. Beyond household worship, Pompeii's residents also observed a calendar filled with public religious festivals throughout the year, honoring various gods associated with agriculture, the changing seasons, and civic prosperity. These festivals often involved public processions, offerings made at temples, and communal meals shared among neighbors, providing regular, expected moments of shared celebration that punctuated the steady rhythm of the town's working year. Returning to the gardens themselves, it is worth imagining the particular, gentle pleasure of a Pompeian evening spent among them. The soft rustle of fig leaves in a light evening breeze, the scent of rosemary and mint growing along a garden path, perhaps the quiet trickle of water from a small fountain, its sound blending easily with the low murmur of family conversation nearby. Birds, drawn by the fruit trees and the shelter offered by garden walls, would have added their own quiet presence to these spaces. Their calls a familiar backdrop to the town's daily life. Even the town's larger public spaces reflected this same appreciation for green, cultivated beauty. The area near the amphitheater included a large planted garden, believed by archaeologists to have functioned partly as a commercial vineyard. Its grapevines tended carefully throughout the growing season, and eventually pressed into wine that would have been sold and consumed throughout the region. This blending of practical agriculture with civic space reflects something quite characteristic of Pompeii as a whole. A town that never fully separated its working life from its more restful, cultivated pleasures, but instead wove the two together throughout its streets, courtyards, and public spaces. As we sit for a while longer in this quiet, imagined garden, surrounded by fig trees and herbs, and the soft sound of water, it is worth simply resting in the stillness of it, a stillness that many Pompeian families would have known well, an ordinary evening spent among growing things, watched over in their own quiet way by the small household gods believed to keep the home safe through another peaceful night. As our journey through the daily life of Pompeii continues, it is time to turn our attention, gently and without any need for alarm, toward the mountain that stood watch over the town for the whole of its long history, and toward what is actually known about the events that eventually unfolded there. For the vast majority of Pompeii's existence, Vesuvius was simply understood as a mountain, not as a volcano in the way we would recognize that term today. The Romans had no real concept of volcanic activity in the sense that modern geology understands it, and there was no living memory in the first century of the Common Era of the mountain ever having erupted. Its most recent major eruption having occurred many centuries earlier, long enough that its violent history had faded entirely from cultural memory and become, instead, simply the shape of a familiar, fertile landscape. We know now, through geological study, that this apparent calm was, in a sense, misleading. Vesuvius is what geologists classify as a stratovolcano, a type of volcano built up over long periods through repeated eruptions. And the long stretch of quiet that Pompeii's residents had known throughout their lives was, geologically speaking, simply a pause between eruptions rather than a sign that the mountain had become permanently dormant. This is, of course, something that could only be understood with the benefit of modern scientific knowledge. To the people living in and around Pompeii at the time, the mountain's stillness would have seemed entirely permanent and unremarkable. There were, however, some signs in the years leading up to the eruption that, looking back with modern understanding, we now recognize as related to the volcanic activity building beneath the region. The significant earthquake that struck Pompeii some years earlier, the one we touched on near the beginning of our journey, causing considerable damage to temples and public buildings throughout the town, is now understood by many geologists and historians to have likely been connected to shifting volcanic activity deep beneath Vesuvius. Even though the people experiencing it at the time would have understood it simply as a natural, if serious, earthquake, the kind that had periodically affected the region throughout its history. In the years following that earthquake, Pompeii had been engaged in a long, steady process of rebuilding, much of which we mentioned in our earlier segments, with scaffolding still standing in parts of the forum and several buildings still undergoing repair. This ongoing reconstruction offers us a quiet, poignant reminder of just how thoroughly the residents of Pompeii understood their earlier earthquake as simply a difficult but ultimately manageable event, a disruption to be steadily repaired and moved past, rather than a warning of anything more significant to come. Modern geological and archaeological research has also identified smaller tremors that appear to have increased in the days immediately before the mountain's eruption, along with other subtle signs, changes in local water sources, for example, that we now understand as common precursors to volcanic activity. At the time, however, these signs would not have carried the same meaning they do to us today. Minor earthquakes were not unusual in this region of Italy, and without any modern understanding of volcanic behavior, there was little reason for the people of Pompeii to interpret a few tremors as anything more than a passing, minor disturbance, similar to ones they and their families had experienced periodically throughout their lives. It is worth pausing here to consider just how ordinary an entirely ordinary day can feel right up until the moment it stops being ordinary, and to hold that thought gently without dramatizing it further. On the day the eruption began, later in the summer of the year 79, life throughout Pompeii appears, based on archaeological evidence, to have been proceeding much as it always had. Bread had been placed in ovens to bake. Shops had opened for the day's business. Households were going about the same steady, unhurried rhythm of daily life. We have spent so much of this documentary exploring together. The eruption itself, when it began, unfolded over the course of many hours rather than in a single sudden moment. And this gradual unfolding is an important part of understanding what actually happened. One we will explore carefully and gently in our next segment. For now, it is enough simply to sit with the image of Pompeii on an entirely ordinary morning, its residents unaware that the mountain overlooking their town, the same mountain that had shaded their vineyards and framed their view for as long as any of them could remember, was, deep beneath its surface, in the process of change. We will move through what happened next slowly and with care, focusing simply on what is factually understood by modern volcanology and archaeology, without any need to dwell on distress. What matters most, as we continue this part of our journey together, is simply understanding, with patience and gentleness, one more chapter in the long, ordinary, and ultimately remarkable story of this small Roman town. We move now, slowly and carefully, into an account of the eruption itself, focusing on what modern volcanology and archaeology have been able to determine, presented factually and without dramatization, in keeping with the calm, steady pace we have kept throughout this entire journey. The eruption of Vesuvius unfolded in two broad phases over roughly 18 to 20 hours, according to the detailed reconstruction developed by volcanologists studying the layers of material preserved at the site. The first phase began in the early afternoon, when the volcano ejected a tall column of pumice, ash, and gas high into the atmosphere, reaching an estimated height of well over 20 kilometers. This column, driven upward by the pressure of built-up volcanic gases, would have been visible for a great distance. And it is this column that Pliny the Younger, a Roman writer who witnessed the eruption from across the bay and later described it in 2 letters to the historian Tacitus, famously compared to the shape of an umbrella pine tree, its trunk rising straight upward before spreading outward at its top. For several hours during this first phase, pumice and ash fell steadily over Pompeii, accumulating gradually on rooftops and in the streets. This period, while certainly alarming to those experiencing it, unfolded slowly enough that many residents of Pompeii appear to have used this time to gather belongings and begin leaving the town. Archaeological evidence, including the relatively low number of victims found within many of the town's buildings compared to its estimated full population, suggests that a significant portion of Pompeii's residents were able to evacuate during these early hours, moving away from the town along roads leading toward Stabii, Nuceria, and other nearby towns, or toward the coast in hopes of escaping by boat. As the afternoon continued into evening, The accumulating weight of pumice on rooftops led to structural collapses in various parts of town, and the falling debris made movement through the streets increasingly difficult, which likely explains why some residents, either unable to leave earlier or choosing to remain and shelter in place, stayed within the town through the night, perhaps believing, reasonably enough given their limited understanding of volcanic events, that remaining indoors was the safer choice. The second and more sudden phase of the eruption began in the early hours of the following morning, when the eruption column, no longer able to sustain its height, began to collapse, sending fast-moving flows of hot gas, ash, and volcanic material down the slopes of the mountain toward the surrounding towns. Volcanologists refer to these flows as pyroclastic density currents, and they moved with considerable speed, reaching Pompeii in a series of distinct surges over the following hours. It was primarily this second phase, rather than the earlier, slower fall of pumice, that resulted in the deaths of those who remained in the town. A process that, according to careful modern study, occurred quickly, with limited prolonged suffering, a detail that many researchers who study this event find, in its own quiet way, at least somewhat comforting to understand clearly rather than leaving to imagination. The nearby towns of Herculaneum, situated closer to the mountain along the coast, and Stabii, further along the bay, experienced similarly significant impacts from these later pyroclastic flows. Each town's experience shaped by its particular distance and position relative to the mountain. It is important, in discussing this event, to hold space for both the scale of what occurred and the calm, factual manner in which we can now understand it. 2,000 years later, through careful scientific study, the famous plaster casts of Pompeii, created using a technique developed in the 19th century by the archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli, who realized that hollow cavities in the hardened ash layer, much like the plant root cavities we discussed in an earlier segment, could be filled with plaster to reveal the forms of those who had been caught within the ash, have given us a uniquely direct human connection to this event. These casts show ordinary people in ordinary final positions, and they are handled by the archaeologists and conservators who study and care for them today with a great deal of respect and quiet consideration, understanding them as a meaningful record of real individuals rather than simply dramatic historical artifacts. What is perhaps most valuable about the extensive study of Pompeii's eruption is how much it has taught modern volcanology about the behavior of similar volcanoes elsewhere in the world. Knowledge that has since contributed meaningfully to evacuation planning and public safety around other active volcanic regions today. In this way, the town's difficult final chapter has, over the centuries since, contributed to genuine, practical understanding that continues to protect communities living near volcanoes around the world in the present day. Ash from the eruption ultimately buried Pompeii under a layer of volcanic material several meters deep. A burial that, while ending the town's active daily life so abruptly, also had the effect of remarkably preserving so much of what we have spent this entire documentary exploring together. The painted walls of family homes, the bread left in bakery ovens, the garden root cavities that would later be so carefully studied, the shops and baths and forum we have walked through this evening in an unusual and rather thoughtful way. The very event that ended Pompeii's daily life also preserved that daily life for us to study and understand with such unusual clarity. Almost 2,000 years later, as we move gently forward from this part of the story, it is worth returning for a moment simply to stillness. The eruption, significant and historically important as it was, represents only one chapter, even if the final one, in a very long and rich story of ordinary daily life that we have spent this evening walking through together, slowly and carefully, room by room, street by street, meal by meal. For nearly 17 centuries after the eruption, Pompeii lay quietly beneath its blanket of volcanic ash and hardened pumice, largely forgotten. Its exact location eventually fading even from local memory, known only vaguely through old place names and the occasional reference in surviving Roman texts. The town's rediscovery came gradually, beginning in the late 16th century, when workers digging a water channel through the region uncovered fragments of ancient wall and inscription, without immediately realizing the full significance of what they had found. It was not until the middle of the 18th century, with the beginning of more deliberate excavations, first at nearby Herculaneum, and later at Pompeii itself, that the true scale of what lay beneath the ground began to be understood. These early excavations, it should be said honestly, were often conducted with far less care than modern archaeological standards would require, driven partly by a desire among wealthy patrons of the time to recover valuable artworks and treasures. And it was only over the following centuries that archaeological practice gradually shifted toward the slower, more careful, more scientifically minded approach that has ultimately given us the rich, detailed understanding of daily Pompeian life that we have spent this documentary exploring together. The work of Giuseppe Fiorelli in the 1860s, whom we mentioned briefly in our previous segment, marked a particularly important turning point, not only through his development of the plaster casting technique, but through his broader insistence on excavating the site systematically, region by region, carefully documenting findings, rather than simply searching for valuable objects. This shift in approach is a large part of why we know so much today about the ordinary details of Pompeian life: the bread in the oven, the plants in the gardens, the graffiti painted on shop walls, rather than only the grander, more valuable artifacts that earlier excavators had prioritized. Excavation and study at Pompeii have continued in various forms right up to the present day. And modern archaeological work at the site now benefits from technologies that would have been unimaginable to those earlier excavators. Ground-penetrating radar, detailed chemical analysis of preserved food remains, careful study of ancient DNA recovered from skeletal remains, and highly precise dating techniques that continue to refine our understanding of exactly when and how various events unfolded. Even now, significant portions of the ancient town remain unexcavated, deliberately left untouched by archaeologists who recognize that future generations, equipped with even more advanced tools and techniques than we currently possess, may be able to learn a great deal more from these areas than could be responsibly extracted using today's methods. What Pompeii offers us, ultimately, is something quite rare in the study of the ancient world. Not simply the grand monuments and famous names that survive in most historical records, but an unusually complete, detailed portrait of entirely ordinary daily life, preserved through a very particular and unusual set of circumstances. We know, because of Pompeii, roughly what an average family's breakfast might have consisted of. We know what plants grew in an ordinary household's garden. We know the layout of a modest apartment above a shop, and the exact wording of a few painted political endorsements on a neighborhood wall. This kind of intimate, granular understanding of everyday life in the ancient world is remarkably uncommon, and it is largely thanks to Pompeii and to the patient, careful work of the archaeologists who have studied it so thoroughly over the past 2.5 centuries that we have it at all. Today, Pompeii remains one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world, drawing millions of visitors each year who walk the same worn stone streets we have spent this documentary exploring together. Streets still marked with the ruts of ancient cartwheels, past the same painted walls, through the same garden courtyards, and into the same bakeries and baths and forum spaces where ordinary Pompeian life once unfolded, day after unremarkable day, for many generations before its final morning. There is something quietly comforting, perhaps, in understanding Pompeii not primarily as a story about disaster, but as an unusually well-preserved window into the steady, ordinary rhythms of daily human life. Families gathering for evening meals, neighbors chatting over garden walls, shopkeepers opening their shutters each morning, children playing in shaded courtyards, and communities gathering together in warm bathhouses and busy forums. Generation after generation, in a town that, for the greater part of its long history, was simply and peacefully alive. As we bring this documentary to a close, it is worth sitting for a while longer with that image. An ordinary town, resting quietly in the warm light of a Mediterranean afternoon, its streets filled with the soft, familiar sounds of daily life, its gardens fragrant with rosemary and fig, its household settling, evening after evening, into rest. Pompeii's story reminds us, gently, of just how much meaning and beauty can be found in entirely ordinary days, the kind of days that at the time felt like nothing more than one more unremarkable turn of an unremarkable week, and that, looking back across so great a distance of time, we can now recognize as something worth remembering carefully and resting in for a while. Thank you for spending this time with us this evening. Sleep well.